Well, thank you everybody for coming today to our first of many teacher refreshers that we are holding here for New England teachers. Like I said, we'll have a few other people trickling in as this goes, but this is our first one. So which means obviously we're going to do an intro and then we're going to talk about the theme a little bit. I guess I should say also that my name is John Taylor. I'm the coordinator from Maine. If you haven't noticed with the sign on the behind me here. I'm hosting this one, but all my colleagues throughout New England will be hosting one of these at some point or another throughout the fall and winter months. And I'm glad you are here for this refresher. We know that this is a time when being on the screen is all you've have been doing for quite a while. So we know that your time is precious, and so we're going to try to keep this short and sweet and to an hour for you. And then you can always come back and reference this as we are recording all of these, and we will put them up on our respective websites as well. So I am going to put in the chat, because we do need to keep track for the Library of Congress of who people from the national office actually speak to in groups like this. And so if you could just fill out the Google form there that's in the chat, I'll put there in a second. It's real simple. It's basically just asking for your email and address. You don't even have to use your personal address. You can use your school address if you'd like, but they are just trying to keep track of what outreach NHD has been doing. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Ashley DeBracco, who is the program assistant there at the national office. Thank you, Ashley.
Thanks, John. I'm excited to be here. And as some of you know, I am a tried and true New Englander, so I am very excited to be joining all of our NHD New England affiliates. So I'm going to go ahead and get started and share my screen. And for some of you, you may see some overlap because I was recently in Connecticut doing an intro for CT teachers. So I've tried to make this as different as possible so that it looks just a hair different, but some of the information will be the same. But as John said, I'm Ashley DeBracco. I'm the program assistant here at National History Day, and I'm going to be talking about debate and diplomacy in history and the successes, failures, and consequences. So how do you analyze debate and diplomacy in history? So the first thing I always start out with, and I know I always get a mixed bag of people that are like, you're going to tell me what NHD is? I've done NHD for 10 years, and I do this for the newbies in the group, or if you're trying to share this with a friend to get them interested, I give my 30-second elevator speech on what NHD is. And of course, NHD is an educational nonprofit across all 50 states, the US territories, and overseas that encourages the teaching and learning of history education. And we do that in our most well-known way through our NHD contest that takes place, of course, at the local, state, and national levels. And I am hopefully excited to see a live contest sometime in the future. Fingers crossed, everyone. But the other way we do that is, of course, through educational programming, and that's the department that I work in. So that involves our online courses, our summer institutes, and any other programming that you see, such as webinars like this. And of course, with the contest, the students have the option to do NHD in a couple of different ways. A category I enjoy, but that tends to get a little less love, is of course our traditional paper category. For students out there that are your brilliant writers, this is the category for them. It's also a little more lenient on the word count. If they like to talk a little bit more about their topics, they have a lot more space to do that in the paper category than say with the exhibit category. Of course, then the exhibit category, probably our most popular category out there. Think of this one as kids who want to go into museums or other types of work, right? This is where they get to design their own museum tile that will explain their entire project. Though this one's really great if they're good with visuals. I swear the exhibits get a little more elaborate every single year. So if they're not interested in that, they might be potential, right, Ken Burns in your classrooms that want to create their own documentaries. This is actually my personal favorite category, but don't tell anyone. I enjoy watching these. So if you've got budding filmmakers in your classroom, the documentary category is for them. You've got kids that are invested in coding, tech, anything like that, the website category where they can actually build that, and it can either be drag and drop, or if they're very invested in learning code, that is an option for them. They are made for the website category. And of course, category that probably would have terrified me as an NHD kid, performances. If you've got drama and theater majors, this one for them. If I had to do this in front of a bunch of people, I probably would have been like, I've forgotten all my lines. But I have seen some amazing NHD performances. And if they like impersonating, right, historical figures and explaining things through drama, this is the category. So now that I've kind of walked you through all of those categories really briefly, we have to contend with that NHD theme, right? Happens every year, we choose a new one. And this year we have debate and diplomacy in history, successes, failures, consequences. So if you'll be brave with me, I'm going to ask you to either write in the chat or you can unmute. I'm happy either way. Tell me, what is a debate? What is debate? How do we define it in context to this? Anyone want to help me out here on this one? And thank you for letting me know my presenter version was swapping. My computer loves to do that. A back and forth exchange of ideas. I like that, Kate. Anyone else? What else is a debate? Arguments, opposing viewpoints, presenting points and counterpoints of an idea. All right, well, I agree. I think those are all right, massive points of any major debate, right? It can be formal, it can be informal. Debate has to contend with, right, opposing ideas, regardless of what those are. Sometimes they're a little more heated, sometimes they're not, right? They may involve two sides, or there may be multiple perspectives involved in any given debate. Now, the bigger question on this one. What is diplomacy? This is the word that everyone trips up on. The last time we did this, everyone went, but how do I explain diplomacy to my middle schoolers? So what is diplomacy? Civilized debate, compromise, respectful negotiation. Thank you to Jolyn and John for using that word compromise. As I have pointed out in the past, if you're struggling to get your students to understand debate and diplomacy, another great way to spin this is to ask them to think about synonyms. And we actually had a theme not too long ago that actually has some really perfect synonyms for debate and diplomacy. If you participated in or know of previous NHD themes, we had conflict and compromise in history. If debate and diplomacy aren't going to work for your classroom, ask them to use those synonyms, right? It's pretty much the same thing. It's done by design, right? So that we can keep everything broad, but a debate is a conflict, right? In a lot of cases. And diplomacy does involve a lot of compromise, or a lack thereof of compromise in some cases. So always think about what other words can I use to talk about these, especially if there's a sticking word that's not going to really work for your students. If diplomacy won't work, think compromise and see what that opens up in the discussion of thinking about that topic. So then we get to the interesting part. So I like to break down all of the different possibilities of debates in history. And I've just come up with 3 simple ways that when I sat down to think about debate in history, what came up. And so there's a couple of ways that I thought about it. So there are a lot of national debates out there. A big one is, of course, the debate around women's suffrage. But how can you take that national debate, that national story that most kids know, and make it a little more personal to them? And the way to do that is to take a national debate and look for those local debates that are already there, right? Those ones that are happening on the ground. And I was actually able to pull this one from the Vermont Historical Society. This is a source that, right, that's talking about women earning the right to vote. These were postcards that were sent out to actual voters in Vermont and encouraging not only them to support women's suffrage, but to get other women to support women's suffrage. So it might get students thinking about, well, I know that suffrage happened and I know that it happened on a national scale, but do I know how suffrage played out in my state? Was it a state that actually supported suffrage and passed laws on suffrage prior to the 1920 Act? So think about how to take those national debates and make them local debates that you can find in your community. Another one leading right into that is debates engage communities. So this is actually from the Maine Historical Society. It is a Temperance Society pledge, and it was signed by a young female who pledged that she would not, engage in the consumption of alcohol. This is how one's particular community, dealt with the issue of prohibition. And Maine has a very interesting history when it comes to prohibition. So think about how, and John's nodding at me, right? So think about, how do debates engage communities? Do they bring communities together? Do they divide communities, right? What are the lasting impacts of a debate that affects a community on a level where there is so much division, especially on a topic, say like temperance or women's suffrage? And then of course, you can look at political debates. Most students love to go for the iconic, I call them, the greatest hits. Big ones out of that, the biggest one is probably Brown v. Board of Education, but they take that iconic moment and they talk about it a lot. But what they don't see is that the debate over desegregation goes well beyond that moment. And of course, Massachusetts, where I pulled this one from, had one of the most massive boycotts, leading to the attempt to desegregate busing in Boston. So how do those political debates, play out? And how do we take those bigger debates that students know about, but maybe give them a different version of the story, spin it a little differently? So those are kind of the debates that I came up with that came to mind when I was starting to do research into thinking about it. But I would love, if you're willing, to hear from you. What other topics spring to mind in terms of debate in history, or other ways that you could look at debate? And you can either put it in the chat or speak up. Give you a couple minutes. Tell me what you think. What debates in history spring to mind that might be interesting, or what ways could you look at debate in history? They don't have to be local. I'm making it local for just mine, the whaling industry. Nice. I know where you might be getting some of those ideas, Cindy. What else? They can be national. Let's see. We have an amazing film collection at the Rhode Island Fair, about the Rhode Island Fair housing law. Oh, well, that's interesting. Most court cases could probably be framed as a debate. That's a great point, Kate. The New Deal. Yes, that's got a lot of debates packed right in there, especially what part of the New Deal you're looking at. All right, so keep them coming, keep thinking about it. Eleanor Roosevelt. Oh, I'd love to see someone do a topic on that one. All right, the other side of this. So, diplomacy in history, or those compromises in history. Well, here's a couple. Probably the easiest one, and one of the ways to maybe do this with younger learners, is to think about diplomacy as seen through treaties. right? They are probably our most prominent if they're looking to do stuff on the history of most indigenous populations, right? Most states or the United States has many treaties with those states before they were, right? Before they were officially the United States. And of course, when the US makes those treaties as a young budding nation. So this is actually treaties with and John, feel free to jump in if I butcher this and you know of it, but the Wabanaki tribes up there in Maine. I'm getting a thumbs up that I have pronounced that correctly. So this is one version of the treaties that you could look at, right? How does diplomacy take place? And when you're looking at a treaty, was there fallout from the treaty? Which side got more in the treaty? If one, is there compromise between them, or does it look like the US took advantage? Or does it look like, right, they were actually agreeing to a lot of what various nations wanted? And do we see debates playing out in those treaties that end in or do not end in diplomatic relations, right? Because we all know that not every treaty ends very diplomatically, and that's something you can point out to students. Sometimes there is an utter lack of diplomacy, and that may come up. Right? Another thing is diplomacy is a key part of civics and government. So if you are looking at this from the gov side, this is another way to really attack this. And I've highlighted one here. This is the Platt Amendment in 1901. Oliver Platt was a Congress member from Connecticut, and he brought up the Platt Amendment, which was a very, very aggressive stronghold on Cuba when it was under the control of the US in the early 1900s. And if you look at the language, it's very leading on what the United States says that Cuba is allowed to do and not do. And so you might look at the way this law shaped the diplomatic relationship between Cubans and the US. And of course, the last one, you can look at diplomacy as culture, right? You can look at it as a cultural exchange. And I am sure that our friends at the US State Department would love it if you could use more of their sources. They have put out a ton that looks at these cultural exchanges between the US and other countries and how those cultures have shaped one another. And so this is just an example of one. In the 1880s, there was a Chinese educational mission. They actually sent Chinese students over to Connecticut, where they were actually taught American English. They were taught westernized ways. They were taught baseball, of all things, right? It does not end well. As tensions between China and the United States, especially in the wake of the Chinese Exclusion Act, happen, China pulls these students back and they are interrogated for, I believe, 120 hours about their experiences in the United States, what they learned. It was overall considered a diplomatic failure by the end, just because of how harshly things had gone with the US. So I'm going to put you on the spotlight again. And I know this one's harder than debates, but what other areas of diplomacy do we see in history? What other topics spring to mind? How might else we look at diplomacy? Ooh, Kate, I love that. And I'm glad that you are plugging civics education, and there are lots of examples over that. And I agree with you. Some really great ones to check out are, of course, ADA that happens in the 90s. And of course, drop some more in, Kate, for our other friends who might be doing civics. Cindy, the establishment of national parks. I like that one. Other debates.
Hey, Ashley, I had a quick question for you.
Yeah.
This thing, for those who haven't met me, I'm one of the coordinators in Massachusetts, and I have to admit, I've been struggling with this part a little bit, that it seems like debate and diplomacy overlap between them potentially, if you're not talking about like official state diplomacy. So are there ways that you found are really useful for helping students to, if they want to say that they're addressing sort of both ideas, like how to really separate those out?
I would say if their topic has both, they need to address both. But if they find that their topic doesn't have both, they just need to put that bluntly.
I think, sorry, let me clarify my question.
Sure.
That you're not necessarily, say, doing a project about a treaty, but you want to talk about the idea of diplomacy more broadly. Have you found some good sort of synonyms or examples of something, say, like this has both debate and diplomacy, and it's not about a treaty, so that kids can kind of grasp that idea of what distinguishes the two? Like, do we want to, is a useful paradigm, for example, that the debate is the exchange of ideas and then the diplomacy is part of the, not compromise, even as I say that out loud, it doesn't kind of quite work, but it's, you know, trying to establish good relations. How have you heard folks talking about the difference between those two ideas?
I get the biggest one that I've heard as of late is really the closest one that comes is conflict and compromise in dealing with those. I would also argue that diplomacy doesn't necessarily have to mean foreign relations, which is something that people are helping to unravel, right? I think you can have diplomacy in an exchange with people. Like, I think the National Park Service article in the theme book, if anyone hasn't checked it out, probably does the best at explaining this, which is they look at debates in labor history, but they talk about the lack of diplomacy between, right, between labor unions and workers and employers. So how do you tease out the fact, right, that yes, there are massive debates in this country over labor, whether it's child labor laws or 8-hour work days or things like that, that right, workers are starting to demand, that unions are starting to demand because their workers are demanding it. And you have employers on the flip side saying, no, I don't want to give you that. I really like the way things are. And some that do say, yes, we can do that. We can make 8-hour work days. We can, you know, end child labor in this factory. Some are really compliant with that. That's, for me, right, that is a form of diplomacy that isn't a treaty because it is involving people actually having to find common ground with each other, right? They are attempting to make a compromise, or they're attempting to resolve something between them. And so don't just think that, right, like diplomacy has to be foreign affairs or that debate has to be something, right, that's really rigid. You can have these blended together by thinking about, okay, these debates spark, and maybe my diplomacy is the fact, right, that at the end of this, people came together to accomplish something, right? They were able to make a plan, they've set a law, right? That is a form of diplomacy. It's the second, if you actually Google the word diplomacy, right, it's that second definition that looks at exchanges between people, right? In order to be able to resolve something, you have to have an exchange where people are willing to come to the table. Does that answer it somewhat, Kate?
That does, that's really helpful, thank you.
Good, I'm glad. I would also recommend, right, checking out the National Park Service article to anyone who hasn't read it. She does, Eleanor, who wrote that article, works at the National Park Service, and she looked at not only child labor, but she looked at laborers out in California. She also got into debates over the environment, right, and looked at the question of, right, who is responsible for the cleanup after the pollution of the Merrimack River, right? So these are all different debates. Again, if you can't come to a healthy resolution, you're kind of lacking diplomacy, and it's okay to say that. I had a student when I was a regional coordinator down in Memphis who wrote a paper that was actually on the lack of compromise between the United States and Lebanon. That is still broaching that topic because you have to talk about the fact that sometimes we don't all agree. We can't come to a resolution. So thank you, Kate, for that question. I think you got my brain thinking about the different ways I would explain that. But any other ideas of diplomacy that play in? I know that I probably segued a little, but any other topics that spring to mind when it comes to diplomacy? or any other topics that come to mind basing off of what Kata said that bring together those concepts of debate and diplomacy and history.
So
Hi,
I'm from the Vermont History Day program, and I like that you used a treaty, a historic treaty between Wabanaki people and settlers, but also one of the things that we have on our list is thinking about recognition, so federal or state recognition of tribes as sovereign nations. And so, you know, thinking just different levels of what nations mean, and who are diplomatic partners. And like here, several Abenaki bands received state recognition just a few years ago, and it was a long fight, but part of that process was a recent way of diplomacy, not treaties, but recognition.
Yeah, I really like that you bring that up, because I think, and this is actually addressed more, and it is on our YouTube channel. We are doing a webinar right now on inspiring student research, and one of the topics is dealing with kind of the interactions between the United States and various Native nations. And the speaker that is doing it made a really good point, which is that when you take treaties actually out of the context and you're looking at recognition, the way that it highlights various Native leaders as having diplomatic power is very key, and it spins those stories in different ways. So I encourage people, if you have students that are interested in those histories of Native nations, don't just think about the treaties. Think about the fact that, right, they have to push for recognition. They have to engage with technically another nation, even though we're sharing land, and I'm using the word share loosely here, even though we're sharing land, right, we are still two different nations coming at this. And how does that diplomacy come into play, especially as land and all of those other ideas that are very different between, right, Americans and various Native nations are so different. So always think about that. It doesn't just have to be the treaties themselves. It can be the other ways that those two groups interact with each other. So thank you, Victoria. All right, and I see that John has put in there presidential doctrines. Nicole says, how about the implementation of the Peace Corps as a means of cultural exchange? Can that be seen as a step toward diplomacy? Is that too much of a stretch? I do not think that is too much of a stress, at least from my perspective. I think the Peace Corps is a really great option, especially if you're looking up, right, why the Peace Corps was founded and those missions that you'll see overseas. I would make sure with that one, though, you're really tying it to the history of the Peace Corps. Otherwise, it's going to dip into what the Peace Corps does currently, which would deal more with its legacy. So make sure that that history component of the Peace Corps and why it's set up and what it's attempting to do, especially under a Cold War, are really key. All right. So the last piece, probably the biggest one, but I think the most important: successes, failures, and consequences. And I say this is the most important part, right? Because this is where a lot of that analysis that is so key to any NHD project is going to come into play, right? We need to be able to discuss whether or not these debates and diplomatic exchanges, whether they happen, right, independent of each other, or if they happen to be intertwined stories, right? Are they successes? Are they failures? Are they a little bit of both? Because I would argue that many have a little bit of both success and failure. And also, what are the consequences of these? So a couple that I like to think about under successes, this is actually a picture of the Free the Panthers protest that happens in May of 1969 on the New Haven Green in Connecticut. And why I like to see it as a success is it is actually a protest to free Bobby Seale and 8 other Panthers who have been arrested as a result of believing they are responsible for the death of a police informant. They protest this. Another one happens at Harvard, actually I think it's like a week or two prior. it goes not so well in Massachusetts. There's a lot of destruction. And so what is done is Yale and the rest of the community members in New Haven decide that they are going to be proactive, and they open up the New Haven Green to anyone who wants to voice their opinions. As a result, this protest is uniquely different than what is seen in Massachusetts prior. It is relatively peaceful. There is very minor violence. It is considered an overall success over the debate of freeing the Panthers. I will hint, those Panthers later become known as the New Haven Nine, and there is a massive court trial in which Bobby Seale is acquitted. But it's a really interesting story to think about how a debate that is so explosive, especially something surrounding the Panthers during the height of Black power, can be relatively peaceful given the right context. So if you haven't heard that story, I highly recommend checking it out. Additionally, my friends in Rhode Island, this is not so a good one. This one I would see more as a failure, at least for me. There is a general textile strike in Rhode Island, and I apologize because that's such say 1934 and not 1943. So excuse me for my typo. But this actually leads to shots fired and the let's just say some police and military presence being brought in during the protest. There are several that are injured as a result of this general strike. It does not go the way that the protesters who were pushing for more workers' rights anticipated, and it led to the governor calling in for reinforcements. As you can see, this is a very interesting shot. Yes, that is exactly what you think it is on the ground, and that's all I will say about that. This one is definitely, in my eyes, a failure as a result of labor debates. And Kate, I would definitely see this one as a failure of diplomacy as well. And of course, the last one I have, just because I thought this was really interesting. So this is the Boston molasses disaster of 1919. And it actually was apparently, and I was fascinated to learn this, there was a vat that was apparently filled with molasses. It was done by a company that apparently ran molasses, and let's just say the construction was not so great. And after a while it eroded, leading to rivers of molasses throughout the Boston area. And it led to a massive debate as to one, who was responsible and who would clean it up. And that could not be resolved diplomatically between all of the parties involved. And it actually took a court case to resolve that one. So, right, this is a consequence of what happens when sometimes things don't work out the way that maybe we want them to. And I think with consequences, you have to think about them in a couple of different ways. One, what are the short-term consequences? Yes, one of the short-term consequences of this is there's molasses everywhere. The long-term consequences of this are, when we have these debates, does it make it harder for, say, people who are supposed to clean up things like this? Do they? Is it effective? Do we give businesses too much leeway because we can't resolve these debates, right? These are all different ways that we see consequences. Another way to think about consequences in this is to think about, right, the short-term and the long-term impacts of any historical event. So it's my last bit where I put you on the spot. Let's chat about successes, failures, consequences. How does that maybe help students analyze debate and diplomacy? And can you think of, a lot of students like to work backwards. So are there any, topics that might spring to mind if we think about what are present day or current event topics that we can trace back in history, that we can see the consequences of presently, but maybe have a longer story in history? Do any spring to mind? side note, the Boston Globe has some amazing historical news about the molasses flood. That is amazing. Everyone should check those out because I actually didn't know about this one. And I went to Elena, our contest manager here at NHD, and the first words out of her mouth was, have you heard about the molasses flood? This one was a new one for me. So everyone check it out. But anyone else have any ways to think about, right, consequences or successes and failures? I like thinking about the ways that a success for one side might be considered a failure for the other side. I think that's a really good point, Victoria. Right, we tend to think of, I'm telling the story from this perspective. And so a lot of times we see it from that one group's perspective of this was a failure or this was a success. But the thing is, generally, a success for one person can be a failure for another group. And it's nice. That's a nice way to weave in those multiple perspectives, which are a piece of any NHD project, I know, and they're on that eval form. So keep that in mind. Anyone else? All right, I'll let you off this time. But I'm going to wrap it up by doing what I like to call shameless plugs. So, of course, if you haven't downloaded a copy of our NHD theme book, please head over to nhd.org/themebook, download yourself a copy. You can check out that National Park Service article that I mentioned. You can also check out some other really great articles. There's one from the National Museum of the American Indian on the Indian Removal Act of 1830. There is one that is more skewed to our history teachers that looks at the various downfall that results from World War I and what that means for the Middle East. Following that, it especially looks at the actions of the British and the French when it comes to that. So if you haven't downloaded a copy, check it out. You can also download a copy of our theme graphic organizer there, which will help students pick out topics. And you can check out our theme introduction video. All right, so I also want to point out we have a ton of new resources that are live right now. This is our Building a More Perfect Union lesson plan book. It contains 15 lesson plans that look at everything from the French and Indian War to the enactment of the Americans with Disabilities Act in the 1990s. And these are very inquiry driven. They are very primary source heavy. So if you're looking for different ideas, this one is full of both debates and diplomacies that might spark some topics for students. We also have our Her Story book. This one looks at just different women from Anne Hutchinson to Sally Ride in US history. And of course, there are some fabulous women that were involved in many debates and efforts of diplomatic exchanges. So one might be a great topic. I know Cindy pushed out Eleanor Roosevelt, but there are some other really great women that are featured in this book that might also be really helping good topics for students who are doing NHD 2022. Of course, NHD has our World War I book. You can get that at nhd.org WWI. And this one is also a lesson plan book that looks at kind of everything from the German immigrant experience all the way to the legacies of World War I in the 20s. So definitely check that one out. And Kate, I'm going to read this one out. So Kate also says that her organization, the Massachusetts Historical Society, has a theme page that they've launched recently with a lot of topic ideas and primary sources. And you can get that at masshist.org/teaching-history/MHS/2022, just for anyone watching who can't see the chat box. All right, and of course, this is our newest resource, and it is a big one. We're talking close to 300 pages, and it is basically a guide to walk teachers through the research process, everything from helping students select a topic to how to implement a thesis statement and historical argument. Each one has been written by a teacher for teachers. So I was one of the editors on this book, but teachers are the experts and they know how to talk to other teachers. So they actually wrote these chapters. They also designed all of the activities that go with each part. So if you're working on the 3 C's with students, there are various activities to help them break down primary sources. So if you haven't downloaded a copy, head over to nhd.org/library-congress-TPS and get a copy. It is completely free to download. All right, and my last plug, I swear, we are hosting our historical argumentation webinar series. Applications are due in November 5th. We have spots for 100 teachers, and we'll actually be going through the entire process of how to make a historical argument and how to write thesis statements for NHD projects. So if you're interested in really honing those skills, please consider applying for this. You can apply at nhd.org/PD. So we'd love to have you join us. All right, last but not least, questions. Please feel free to ask me anything that won't get me fired. Other than that, it's fair game. All right, I'm also going to read, Cindy says, Connecticut History Day also has a topics list. It is at historydayct.org/uploads/2/5/6/0. Ooh, that one's a fun one. /25607955/CT topic list -2021-22 PDF. So if you can't find it, Googling will probably work. And Victoria says the Vermont theme sheet was a late/recent addition to the info for the educators page. And that one's at vermonthistory.org/client media/files. I really hope, John, you're collecting these. So I don't think they're going to do very well recording them. And Geraldine says Rhode Island's will be up next week. Maine is coming soon. So with that, does anyone have any questions about the theme or anything that I have said that maybe was confusing? And if not, or you think of something later, I'm going to put my contact information up on the screen. Oh, questions?
Ashley, have you been receiving questions from teachers or students? Are you getting any sort of, frequently asked questions?
At this point, no. But if you check with me in maybe a month, that answer will be different. The biggest one we get is, do debate and diplomacy have to both be in there? That ampersand likes to cause a lot of really fun questions. And my answer is, it's complicated because no. Debate and diplomacy, yes, can be intertwined. They can also be separate. You will find topics that are really debate without diplomacy. You will find diplomacy without debate. Yes, it does happen. And what I tell them, as long as you can argue and you can explain that, yes, you looked for debate and diplomacy and you didn't find it, you need to address that. That's the number one question we get at this point is, do I have to do both? And the answer is yes, unless you just have a topic that doesn't have it. I consider those very rare topics because you'll probably find both debate and diplomacy. And speaking to Kate's question on this, it's just how you look at debate and diplomacy. But that's the big one right now. Other than that, we get specialized questions. Can I do this for my topic? As long as you can make the argument for it, absolutely. And as long as your teacher approved it, because I'm not getting in trouble for that one. But as long as your teacher and your parent is happy. And so those are the specialized questions we get. But at this point, the questions are not rolling in yet. Give me a month and I guarantee you I will probably have about 5 questions that I answer on repeat. So, any other questions? Well, if you think of anything, my contact information is here. My email address is really simple, ashley@nhd.org. And of course, because I like to put her on the spot, if you have a question related to our national contest, you can contact our contest manager, Elena McNaughton, and hers is elena@nhd.org, and she will love to answer all of your questions about contest. She knows more about that than I do. But if you've got questions about programs, and I will hint this up, keep a lookout. We are opening applications for our Sacrifice for Freedom World War II in the Pacific Student and Teacher Institute. So if you're interested in learning more about World War II and say want a trip to Hawaii, you should consider applying. Oh. With that, if there are no questions, John, I'm going to toss it back over to you.
Thank you, Ashley, for doing that and all the plugs there. That was very nice. Yeah, I just want to say, since you mentioned Elena, Elena, I believe, will be our next speaker for us on November 1st. Registration links will be coming out soon from all of us, all of the different programs here in New England. She will be covering how to actually build a website using NHD Web Central. And so I do know there are some new features there that they are still currently working on. And so that will be coming soon as well. So she'll be able to unveil a lot of that for New England teachers as well. So that
I also want to put a plug in for that, John, that is there for teachers and students. So if you have students who know the website, or for some of these other ones, when we do things like historical argumentation, these other things, if students want to attend, get a refresher, or watch these videos later, they're absolutely welcome.
Yes, thank you. Yes, that's absolutely correct. Actually, I think many of the programs from this point forward should be geared a little more towards students and teachers. But please look out for emails and social media posts from all of us, all of the coordinators in your respective states, coming with registration links for the upcoming teacher refreshers that will be throughout the fall and winter months. And we will still be adding a few more in January as well. So please keep an eye open for that as well. So if there are no other questions, we'll go ahead and close this session out, and I will send out the recordings to all of my colleagues in the next couple of days so they can post it on all their respective sites. But I do appreciate you taking your time for coming and spending your time, or at least an hour of your time with us today. And we will see you soon in November, if not earlier.
Thank you so much, Ashley.
Thanks, Kate. I hope the herding cats is going well.
It's only just beginning.